They thought they could bully me off my own land. The HOA locked the road, blocked the trail, and even threatened to fine me for trespassing. But they had no idea. The only way into this entire mountain valley is my bridge. And when I pulled the deed, the whole HOA froze. Stick around, because what I did next didn't just shut them down. It made them beg. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let me tell you exactly how I turned their power trip into my greatest revenge. The cabin wasn't just a building tucked into the woods. It was the last piece of my grandfather I had left. He built it in the 1970s with his own hands, long before there was a paved road or cell phone signal in the area. Over time, it became our family's quiet retreat. No electricity, just a fireplace, a wooden dock by the river, and the sound of wind moving through the pine trees. As a kid, I'd come out here every summer. It was where I learned to fish, chop wood, and understand silence. After my grandfather passed away, he left it to me in his will. I never really understood why until years later, when life started to fall apart. I worked a high-stress job in the city, managing logistics for a major tech company. 70-hour weeks, endless meetings, constant phone notifications. I thought I could handle it. Until I couldn't. My doctor called it burnout. I called it losing myself. The world was too loud, too fast, too disconnected. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I packed a bag, drove 4 hours into the hills, and crossed the same old bridge my grandfather had built over the narrow creek, the one that separated the valley from the rest of the world. The bridge creaked the same way I remembered. So did the screen door on the porch. And when I stepped inside and breathed in that mix of pine with smoke and history, something in me started to heal. The first few days were just about survival. I had to relearn how to live without Wi-Fi or Uber Eats. I chopped wood, fetched water from the well, and listened to birds instead of podcasts. Then something strange happened. I started sleeping again. My hands stopped shaking. I didn't check my phone. I didn't need to. That cabin reset something inside me that had been out of sync for years. I stayed there for 2 weeks the first time, came back to work sharper, calmer, and finally able to say no when things got too much. After that, the cabin became my sacred space. Every month, I'd spend a few weekends there. In spring, I'd plant wildflowers by the edge of the property. In summer, I'd hike the trails my grandfather cleared decades ago. And in winter, I'd bring a thermos of coffee, wrap myself in a thick coat, and sit by the fire while snow blanketed the world outside. I never minded being alone up there. That silence was what made the place powerful. For years, I thought no one even knew the cabin was there. The trail was hidden, unmarked, and far enough from the nearest homes that I never had to worry about anyone wandering in. The only real access was through that narrow wooden bridge that connected to the main road, a bridge I assumed was just part of the forest, until I finally looked at the deed one day and saw the name. Private Access Bridge, registered to James T. Collier. My grandfather. I remember thinking how proud he would have been to know I kept it all intact. No upgrades, no developers, just nature, solitude, and family legacy. I had no idea that was about to be tested. Things started to change when new construction appeared about a half-mile down the valley. A small group of homes, then a community center. Eventually, someone formed a homeowners association. I didn't think much of it. The cabin wasn't in their neighborhood. It wasn't on their map. As far as I was concerned, I lived beyond their reach. But soon, new fences started going up. Trail markers disappeared. One weekend, I arrived to find a paper notice stapled to a tree near the trail entrance. Warning, unauthorized access subject to fine. HOA restricted zone. I laughed at the time, thinking it must have been a mistake. After all, the land had been in my family for decades. No one had ever questioned that. I took the sign down, tossed it in the truck bed, and went on with my weekend. But it didn't stop there. More signs appeared. Then came emails from an HOA compliance officer I'd never heard of, telling me I was in violation of community trail use rules. They said my use of the main trail was unauthorized, that I needed to apply for special access, and that failure to do so would result in legal consequences. That was the moment something in my gut shifted. It was like watching a stranger walk into your living room and tell you to leave. That trail, that bridge, that entire valley had been part of my life for decades. I knew every inch of it. And now, a bunch of strangers with printed badges were trying to tell me I was trespassing? I didn't say anything right away. I didn't write back or make a scene. I just pulled out the old property box from my attic, dusted it off, and opened it up. Inside were every deed, survey, and boundary line my grandfather had kept. And what I found changed everything. The HOA thought they had control, but they had no idea. They were crossing my bridge to get in. Everything changed the moment the HOA elected a new president. Her name was Diane Whitmore, and she was the kind of person who wore a clipboard like armor and treated every property line like a battleground. Before her, the HOA was barely noticeable. It existed more in theory than in action, mostly just neighbors checking in, managing shared landscaping, and organizing occasional barbecue. But Diane didn't see the HOA as a community effort. She saw it as her personal kingdom. The first thing she did was push for a rewrite of the community charter. Under the guise of protecting shared assets, she expanded the definition of what fell under HOA jurisdiction. Hiking trails, gravel service roads, and even the forested boundaries near the creek were suddenly reclassified as common use areas. It didn't matter that they were outside the original HOA plan, or that they ran dangerously close to properties that were never part of the neighborhood. If it could be walked on, seen from a drone, or marked on Google Earth, Diane claimed it for the HOA. She called it preservation, but it felt more like occupation. Residents started getting notices for things they'd done for years without issue, like hanging wind chimes, parking RVs near the trail, or placing seasonal decorations too close to green spaces. Diane even fined one elderly couple for having an unregistered bench in their own backyard, claiming it was on shared viewing land. People were shocked. Some resisted. Others just paid the fines to avoid conflict. But it was clear the HOA wasn't what it used to be. At the monthly meetings, Diane sat at the head of the table like a CEO addressing a boardroom. Every concern was met with legal jargon, references to revised bylaws, or threats of enforcement. She loved to quote phrases like unified compliance and mandatory easement integrity. Few understood what she meant, but most were too intimidated to push back. She hired a part-time compliance officer who wore a reflective vest and carried a notepad like he was on patrol. Residents even joked he was just a mall cop with a clipboard, but that didn't stop him from issuing citations. Then came the real overreach. Diane ordered metal gates to be installed on all the unofficial trailheads leading into the forest. These trails have been used for decades by hikers, dog walkers, even horseback riders. One of them happened to be the very trail that led toward my family's cabin. Without warning, a metal bar was erected across the path with a bold sign that read, HOA access only. Trespassers will be prosecuted. The message was clear. Whatever wasn't hers, she was going to take. She claimed the gates were necessary to keep out illegal dumping and unauthorized hikers, but no one had seen any evidence of those things. What was really happening was obvious to anyone paying attention. Diane was tightening her grip, and she wasn't doing it for safety. She was doing it for control. The worst part? Most residents didn't even know what she was doing. She buried the new regulations in long, unread PDFs emailed out with vague subject lines like Community Safety Update. Buried deep within were passages about expanding HOA borders, requiring access permits, and revoking entry privileges to non-members. By the time anyone realized how much had changed, the rules were already in place. Diane's next move was to begin charging access fees for shared use infrastructure, which now, according to her, included parts of the gravel road leading into the valley. She insisted it was necessary to maintain the trails and protect wildlife. But what she didn't mention was that the road she was talking about wasn't even part of the original HOA layout. It connected directly to the bridge my grandfather built and ran straight through private property. I wasn't the only one who raised eyebrows. A few longtime residents began speaking out, asking why they were suddenly paying for access to places they'd always walked freely. Diane responded with veiled legal threats, suggesting those who didn't comply might face restrictions of service or legal recourse. People backed down, afraid of losing access to their own driveways or facing lawsuits they couldn't afford. It became clear Diane's strategy was simple. expand, threaten, collect. What she hadn't realized, or maybe just didn't care to research, was that in all her power grabs, she had crossed a line. A very real, legal line that existed on paper, on maps, and in the official county records. That trail she gated, that wasn't hers. That gravel road she claimed for the HOA, it ran through land that had been privately owned since before the neighborhood even existed. And most importantly, the one thing she truly needed to pull off this land grab, the bridge that gave everyone access to the valley, she didn't own that either. But she would find that out soon enough. Because while Diane played chess with the neighborhood, thinking she was 5 steps ahead, she didn't know the board itself belonged to someone else. It started like any other trip. A cooler packed in the back seat, some tools, a bag of groceries, and a usual 4-hour drive up the winding roads toward the cabin. But this time, something was different. As the gravel road curved toward the entry trail, something unfamiliar came into view. A large, silver gate bolted shut across the access path that had always been open. Just beyond the gate, staked in the ground at a harsh angle, stood a freshly printed metal sign. It was bold, official-looking, and aggressive in tone. Private property, HOA access only. No trespassing. Violators will be fined. There was no mistaking the message. The HOA had physically blocked the only direct trail that led up to the family cabin. The trail that had been used by my grandfather, my father, and me for decades. No notice, no warning, no legal justification. Just a sudden, unannounced declaration that access was no longer allowed unless approved by a homeowners group I had never joined, never needed, and never even interacted with. At first glance, it looked like an oversight. A mistake, maybe, but the deeper I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't a one-off error. It was part of a calculated move. The trail wasn't just blocked. It had been cleared of all old signage, branches, and overgrowth. Someone had intentionally restored it to make it look like HOA-maintained land. Fresh tire tracks indicated maintenance crews had recently been up there. And the gate? Brand new, professionally installed, with a coated keypad and welded support poles sunk deep into the ground. Worse yet, I wasn't the only one being shut out. Other longtime hikers and trail users in the area reported similar blockages. Strange warnings and enforcement notices appearing in their mailboxes. Some even received official-looking letters threatening fines if they continued using what the HOA now labeled as restricted shared access routes. These were trails no one had ever claimed before. Paths that existed on public and private lands long before the HOA was even formed. Yet now, under the leadership of the new president, they were suddenly being claimed and sealed off. It wasn't just overreach. It was a land grab, and it was happening quietly, one path at a time. Within days, a letter showed up in my mailbox at the main residence. It was printed on thick paper and sealed with the HOA's letterhead. Inside was a formal notice of unauthorized use, citing my use of private HOA-maintained trails and referencing a new regulation code I'd never heard of. It claimed my recent presence on the block trail was a violation of Section 8B of the revised community rules, and that future trespassing could lead to civil penalties or law enforcement action. There was no phone number, no explanation of appeal, just a warning, and a demand to me to register with the HOA compliance office if I intended to continue accessing my property via what they now called HOA perimeter zones. To say I was stunned would be an understatement. This was land I had crossed since childhood, a trail my grandfather had carved himself with nothing more than a shovel and an axe. The idea that someone in a suburban office who had never seen the valley from a ridge or smelled the pine smoke from our old chimney believed they had the right to gate it off was infuriating. I began reviewing old documents, my grandfather's hand-drawn maps, county zoning records, the original surveyor's notes from the 1970s. What I found made everything even more absurd. The trail didn't even fall within the HOA's original boundary lines. In fact, large portions of their so-called perimeter zone overlapped with land that had never been part of any subdivision. Somehow, they had quietly extended their imaginary fences and assumed no one would notice or care. But the real turning point came when I pulled out the property deed once again and started examining the boundaries in detail. I traced the access route from the main road, across the small river, and toward the cabin. That's when it hit me. The bridge, the narrow wooden one that every single vehicle and resident used to enter or leave the valley, wasn't just a crossing. It was a boundary line, and it belonged to me. When my grandfather built that bridge in the early 1980s, he'd done so on land that was completely outside the jurisdiction of any HOA or development. He'd maintained the structure himself and kept legal ownership through the county, including full rights to control access. Over the years, the nearby neighborhood had grown, and the bridge had become an unofficial shared route. But legally, nothing had changed. The right-of-way was still privately held. And now, the HOA had locked me out. By using a path that ran directly through land, they had no legal right to access without my permission. They thought the gate was the end of the road for me. What they didn't realize was the road they were guarding started at a bridge I owned. And I was about to remind them of that in the most unforgettable way possible. The moment the HOA tried to block my access, I knew I had to go deeper. Not just into the paperwork, but into the history that my grandfather left behind. The kind of old-school, handwritten, notarized documentation that predates every digital record the HOA was banking on. I didn't trust emails, PDFs, or flashy HOA newsletters. I needed the hard proof, and I knew exactly where to find it. The fireproof lockbox tucked away in the back of my grandfather's old workbench. Inside, I found what most people would probably consider junk: brittle blueprints, county zoning maps from the 1970s, and thick manila folders stamped with dates and seal-embossed signatures. But among the clutter, I found it. The original property deed, complete with a hand-drawn boundary map and surveyor annotations. It was beautiful in its simplicity and brutal in its clarity. The trail the HOA was now claiming clearly marked outside any neighborhood development line. And right there in thick, faded black ink was the single most important detail of all: the bridge. Listed as a privately constructed access bridge, it was documented under the name of James T. Collier, my grandfather, and had been registered as a right-of-way on his land, not the HOA's. The land it connected to was his too, and there was no clause granting shared or public use. It wasn't a public utility. It wasn't HOA maintained. It was Collier-owned land from end to end, which meant the only legal access into the entire valley, including the homes and trails on the other side, depended on that one narrow bridge. The HOA had been using it for years under the assumption that it fell into the same gray area as the trails and paths they were quietly absorbing into their jurisdiction. But the bridge wasn't a gray area. It was crystal clear. There were property lines, signatures, legal acknowledgments, and nowhere in their charter, bylaws, or expansion documentation was there any mention of a transfer of rights. In short, they'd been crossing private land without permission, not just on foot, but with vehicles, emergency services, deliveries, and construction crews. And now they were locking me out? That discovery flipped everything. What the HOA saw as their main road was actually part of an old forestry access route my grandfather had maintained long before there was a neighborhood. Over time, as development spread, people started using the bridge because it was the most convenient entry point into the valley. But that convenience had bred complacency. The HOA assumed it was public, but legally, it had never been turned over. The only reason they had gotten away with using it so long was because no one had stopped them. Until now, as I kept digging, I found even more leverage. Old correspondence between my grandfather and the county highway department showed that when he built the bridge, he had declined the county's offer to make it public in exchange for routine maintenance. His exact words: "I'd rather fix it myself than let the county take what's mine." That stubborn independence turned out to be a legal gift. By keeping ownership, he preserved my right to control who used the structure and under what conditions. The HOA had made a critical error. They treated the area like one big monopoly board, buying up influence, expanding boundaries, and rewriting rules. But what they failed to understand was that the board itself, the physical access point, didn't belong to them, and they never even thought to check. They were so confident in their authority that they never questioned how the land was laid out decades ago. But land doesn't care about power trips. It cares about deeds, signatures, and recorded filings. Armed with this information, I now had legal standing to challenge every action they had taken, from blocking the trail to issuing fines for unauthorized access. They were, in fact, the ones trespassing. And worse, they had monetized that trespass by charging HOA members for access to an area they didn't even own. That opened the door to civil penalties, legal exposure, and possibly even fraud investigations if it ever went to court. The deeper I looked, the stronger my position became. The HOA had no easement rights, no lease, no agreement, just assumptions. And assumptions don't hold up in court, especially not against a clean chain of ownership and a decades-old legal record that clearly states who built the bridge, who owns the land, and who controls the only way in or out of that valley. It was no longer about revenge or frustration. It was about setting the record straight. The HOA believed they could gate off my past, but they forgot that my past was written in ink, signed by the county, and reinforced with property law. They didn't just mess with a cabin. They crossed into something they couldn't control. Something older, stronger, and more protected than any bylaw they could draft. They thought they could play power games on paper. But I had paper that played back, and it was about to shut them down. Once the facts were clear, the next step was strategy. I had the legal upper hand, but waving papers around wasn't going to change anything overnight. The HOA had grown comfortable, arrogant, even, in assuming their authority extended wherever they pointed. Simply confronting them wouldn't be enough. They needed a reality check that couldn't be ignored or buried under a flood of HOA jargon. If they wanted to play games with access and control, then I would let them, but on my terms. The first move was securing the bridge. Not just symbolically, but physically. For years, it had been a rustic wooden structure, sturdy but humble, the kind you'd expect to find on private forest land. But now, it had to become a statement. I hired a licensed surveyor to come out and mark every inch of the property line, including the land surrounding both ends of the bridge. Flags were posted, coordinates were filed, and every piece of data was uploaded directly to the county records office. Next came reinforcement. A private security contractor installed a new access gate, not a flimsy chain and padlock like the HOA used, but commercial-grade, motorized steel gate with keypad entry and remote lockout capability. It was positioned right before the bridge's entrance, angled in such a way that no vehicle could pass without being granted explicit access. On both sides of the gate, signs were placed in clear, professional font. Private bridge, access by written permission only, trespassing subject to prosecution under state law. There was no ambiguity, no loophole, no room for misinterpretation. To cover myself further, I drafted and filed an official notice of restricted use with the county, stating that public access to the bridge was revoked effective immediately due to unauthorized use by non-permitted parties. A copy of the notice was sent via certified mail to the HOA office, along with a copy of the original deed and a formal cease and desist letter. Everything was tracked, time-stamped, and notarized, but that was just the beginning. To ensure there would be no claims of ignorance, I mailed copies of the same documentation to every homeowner in the HOA, along with a friendly but firm letter explaining the facts. The bridge was private property. The HOA had no legal easement, and anyone continuing to use the bridge without written permission would be in violation of state trespass laws. I made it clear this wasn't about cutting anyone off. It was about protecting land rights that had been violated. Then I installed security cameras. Discrete, solar-powered, motion-activated units with real-time cloud storage. They were positioned to monitor both traffic and behavior on either end of the bridge. Footage would serve as proof of unauthorized use, should legal action ever be necessary. And it turned out to be a smart move, because within the first 48 hours, several HOA vehicles were recorded turning around in confusion, clearly unaware that anything had changed. The next layer of the trap was digital. I set up a temporary access system, an online request form where individuals could apply for permission to use the bridge. It asked for name, purpose of visit, vehicle registration, and proof of need. It was legal, fair, and fully documented. But more importantly, it proved one thing. The HOA never had any formal agreement in place. Because when they received that link and saw the form, they didn't know how to respond. Their silence spoke volumes. As expected, Pushback came quickly. A curt email from the HOA president arrived a few days later, demanding I remove the gate and accusing me of obstructing community access. She cited vague claims about historic use rights and called my actions a disruption to the established order. But none of her accusations were rooted in law. Her email didn't include a single legal document, county filing, or recorded easement. Just bluster. I replied with a brief message. Please refer to the enclosed deed, survey, and county notice. If the HOA believes it holds legal rights to my private bridge, feel free to present evidence through proper legal channels. Until then, all access is suspended. After that, the email stopped. What Diane and the board didn't realize yet was that this was more than just a fence or a sign. It was a message to every resident, every HOA official, and anyone else who assumed authority came from a clipboard and a title. The bridge had never belonged to them. And now, for the first time in decades, someone was finally making that clear. It wasn't about isolation or revenge. It was about leverage. Quiet, legal, indisputable leverage. The kind that doesn't need shouting or threats. The kind that comes with locks, documents, and a very clear no backed by law. The HOA had made a mistake by trying to play landowner. Now they were about to learn what happens when the real landowner plays back. The moment the gate locked and the bridge access shut down, the ripple effects across the entire community were immediate and louder than expected. Within just a couple of days, the HOA began receiving complaints from its own members. Residents were confused as to why Amazon deliveries weren't making it to their doorsteps. Landscaping crews were delayed. Even the garbage collection truck skipped a few scheduled pickups. The bridge they had always used, the only bridge that connected their development to the nearest county road, was now closed. At first, they blamed the county. Then they blamed the weather. But when those excuses ran out, all eyes turned to the HOA board, demanding answers. The HOA president, Diane Whitmore, tried to spin the situation. She referred to it as a temporary obstruction due to a dispute over easement interpretation. But that vague corporate language didn't calm anyone. Homeowners wanted to know why the main access point had a keypad lock, surveillance cameras, and legal warning signs all over it. And more importantly, why no one was notified in advance. Behind closed doors, panic set in. The board had never asked for an easement, never filed for permission, and never paid a cent toward maintenance of the bridge or surrounding access trail. Yet, for years, they had operated under the assumption that historic use gave them some unspoken right to it. Now, with the legal documents exposed and filed with the county, that assumption had collapsed. Without access to that bridge, the entire neighborhood was quite literally boxed in. The only alternate road in the region was a rugged fire service road on the opposite side of the mountain, barely maintained, steep, and prone to seasonal washouts. It wasn't a viable option for regular traffic. For many residents, the now-locked bridge was the only real lifeline. Emergency services were among the first to notice. The local fire department attempted to use a route during a training drill and found the gate sealed. A report was filed with the HOA, flagging concerns about delayed response times. That report made its way to several homeowners, further igniting anger. Questions were raised about liability, safety, and the board's overall competency. Some residents, previously indifferent to HOA politics, now began digging through meeting notes and budget allocations. What they found only made things worse. The HOA had spent thousands on perimeter trail upgrades and land beautification, without ever confirming legal rights to the areas they had altered. Diane tried damage control. She scheduled an emergency board meeting and encouraged attendance. Flyers were distributed promising clarification about the access situation. But the gathering turned into a hostile forum, with dozens of residents demanding answers. They wanted to know why they were being told they couldn't use a road they'd driven on for years, why they now needed permission to access their own homes, why trucks were turning around, why their property values were suddenly in question. Faced with mounting pressure, Diane attempted to shift the blame. She claimed that the property owner, me, was uncooperative, aggressive, and refusing to honor community relationship. But that narrative didn't stick. Too many residents had read the documents I'd sent, They had seen the bridge deed. They had learned that no permission had ever been sought, no agreement ever signed. And most importantly, they knew the HOA had made the mistake. Not me. By the end of the week, the HOA received its first formal petition demanding action. Over 30 homeowners signed a letter calling for a reversal of trail expansion policies and a legal review of the board's conduct. Several members called for Diane's resignation. Some even threatened to sue the HOA for mismanagement and negligence, citing her failure to properly verify property rights before enacting changes that affected the entire community. Behind the scenes, the HOA's lawyer quietly reached out to me, requesting a meeting to discuss potential access agreements. The tone was different now, respectful, conciliatory, and more than a little desperate. But I didn't rush to respond. They had spent months trying to push me on my own land, acting with arrogance and zero accountability. Now that the tables had turned, they wanted grace. But respect isn't something you demand after you've ignored it. The irony of it all was sharp. The same board that accused me of trespassing was now entirely dependent on my goodwill to regain access to their own homes. The same HOA that claimed jurisdiction over trails and roads had no legal route in or out without crossing private property they never bothered to understand. It wasn't just a power shift. It was a collapse of the illusion they'd built. In the end, the HOA didn't just lose access. They lost credibility. They lost control. And they were quickly learning that the true power in any neighborhood doesn't come from printed rules or laminated name tags. It comes from knowing the land, respecting boundaries, and never underestimating the quiet person who owns the only bridge in. When the HOA realized their position was legally indefensible, the tone of their communication shifted fast. The aggressive language disappeared. So did the threats of fines and enforcement. Instead, I began receiving polite emails from their lawyer and short letters with phrases like seeking cooperation, amicable resolution, and mutually beneficial understanding. Eventually, Diane Whitmore herself reached out, the same woman who once accused me of trespassing, now hoping to clear up the misunderstanding and restore harmony. But it was never a misunderstanding. It was entitlement. It was the assumption that power and paperwork were enough to override history, family legacy, and legal ownership. After months of hostility and overreach, a half-hearted apology and a handshake weren't going to fix what they tried to erase. Their sudden change of attitude wasn't a gesture of goodwill. It was survival. They needed that bridge. And for the first time, they were forced to admit it. Diane requested a meeting in person. She offered coffee neutrality and an open discussion about usage terms. I declined, not out of spite, but out of principle. If the HOA wanted something from me, access, easement rights, they would have it treated as a formal negotiation, not a casual favor. So I did what they failed to do from the beginning. I put everything in writing through an attorney with clear terms. The document I submitted wasn't unreasonable. It offered a legally binding access agreement for bridge usage under my conditions. The HOA would acknowledge in writing that they had no ownership over the bridge, trail, or surrounding land. They would pay a monthly access fee based on the number of homes that required use of the bridge, with half of those funds going directly to maintenance and repairs, and the other half donated to a local wildlife preservation organization, the same one Diane had tried to keep off the trails for not having HOA clearance. Additionally, the HOA would be responsible for any damages to the bridge, including wear from heavy vehicles or snowplow operations. They would also be required to install a sign at the entrance of their development, clearly stating that the bridge was privately owned and maintained under restricted use. Lastly, any future construction or expansion that required equipment to cross the bridge would need prior written approval from me, with detailed scheduling and liability waivers in place. The response from the HOA board was tense. Diane tried to push back, calling the terms unfair and punitive, but by that point, her influence was gone. The homeowners had seen the documentation. They'd lived through the disruption, and many were furious that her ego had dragged the entire neighborhood into legal conflict with a landowner who had simply been trying to mind his business. In the next HOA meeting, multiple residents stood up and demanded her resignation. One homeowner, a retired civil engineer, pointed out that Diane's failure to verify bridge ownership before installing gates and expanding trail claims could have opened the HOA up to massive liability, especially if emergency services had ever been delayed due to blocked access. Another member called for a full audit of HOA decisions made under her leadership, including the use of community funds for projects conducted on non-HOA property. The vote wasn't even close. Diane stepped down before the meeting ended. Her replacement, a quiet and reasonable man named Mark Reyes, reached out soon after and agreed to the access terms. Unlike Diane, he didn't come with arrogance or passive-aggressive remarks. He understood that trust had been broken and that transparency was the only way forward. The contract was signed. The fee schedule was implemented. And for the first time in months, the bridge was open again, not as an assumed public road, but as a privately owned structure under a formal, legally recognized agreement. But even with the contract in place and the access restored, I didn't forget what had happened. I didn't forget the signs they stapled to trees. I didn't forget the citations mailed to my house. And I certainly didn't forget how quickly they tried to erase decades of family history with one gate and a few emails. That's why I took the extra step. I installed a new plaque at the entrance of the bridge, not out of vanity, but as a reminder. It read, Collier Bridge, privately owned since 1982, accessed by agreement only. No gate, no keypad, just a name, and history that wouldn't be rewritten by people who had never earned the right to claim it. The apology had come too late. The damage was already done. But now, so was the lesson. The HOA learned that respect isn't granted through bylaws, titles, or neighborhood votes. It's earned by knowing where your authority ends and where someone else's begins. They pushed too far, and the pushback was revenge. It was accountability. They tried to lock me out. But in the end, I didn't just unlock the bridge. I locked in a boundary they would never cross again. With the contract signed and the bridge firmly back under my control, life finally settled into a quieter rhythm. But it wasn't the same kind of peace I'd known before. This was different. It wasn't just the silence of the forest or the calm of a weekend retreat. It was the satisfaction of reclaiming something that should never have been challenged in the first place. The HOA had been forced to recognize boundaries. And in doing so, they'd exposed just how fragile their sense of control really was. The bridge, once taken for granted by nearly everyone in the area, now stood as a symbol, not just of access, but of ownership legacy and the importance of knowing what you're entitled to protect. People saw the sign. They read the name. And even if they didn't fully understand the story behind it, they felt the shift. The quiet assumption that the HOA governed every inch of the valley had been broken, and that realization rippled through the community like a wake-up call. For the first time in years, I felt like my grandfather's hard work had been honored properly, not with a monument or a ceremony, but with action, with resistance, with a refusal to be intimidated by bureaucracy. And that gave me a freedom I hadn't expected. Not just freedom from interference, but freedom to take ownership of my land in a deeper way. I began investing more time into the cabin, restoring the woodwork, clearing new walking paths, and planting native trees along the creek. Every nail I drove, every fence I mended, felt like a message. This is mine and I know it. The neighbors changed, too. A few of them reached out directly, not as HOA members, but as individuals. They shared their frustrations with the previous board, told me how powerless they'd felt, and admitted they had no idea the HOA had crossed such a serious line. Some even apologized for staying silent when they should have spoken up. I didn't blame them. Most of them were just trying to live their lives in peace. The same way I was. They were victims of overreach, too, just in a different way. What surprised me most was how many people started asking questions about property rights, easements, and what their own deeds actually said. A quiet movement began in the neighborhood, one focused on transparency and accountability. Residents demanded clearer language in HOA documents. They insisted on legal reviews before any new policies were enacted. Some even began advocating for voluntary participation in certain programs, pushing back against the assumption that one board could rule with unchecked authority. In a strange way, the whole ordeal had done something good. It reminded people where real ownership comes from, not from a vote, a rule book, or a committee, but from the ground itself, From deeds recorded, land surveyed, and families who care enough to protect what's theirs. Even the atmosphere at the cabin began to shift. It no longer felt like a place I had to defend. It felt like a place I had fortified. When I sat on the porch and listened to the creek flowing beneath the bridge, I wasn't listening for trouble anymore. I was listening with pride, knowing that my quiet stand had reshaped an entire neighborhood's understanding of what it means to push back when lines are crossed. I documented the entire experience in a personal blog post, not to shame anyone, but to help others who might be facing similar issues. It went viral in a few rural homeowner forums. Dozens of people reached out from all over the country, sharing stories of fake HOAs, unrecorded easements, and gated access being weaponized by those with just enough authority to intimidate, but not enough to be lawful. What I thought was a local battle turned out to be part of a much bigger problem. And in some small way, my experience helped people start to push back. That, more than anything, felt like the ultimate win. Because it wasn't just about protecting my land anymore. It was about showing others how to protect theirs. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need lawsuits or loud confrontations. All I needed was the truth, the patience to let it work, and the willingness to draw a hard line when no one else would. Now, the bridge stands exactly as it should, not just as a structure of wood and steel, but as a message carved in stone. You don't get to take what you didn't build. You don't get to rule what you never owned. The HOA learned that lesson the hard way, and I walked away with something far more valuable than just control of a road. I walked away with peace, respect, and a kind of freedom they never even knew existed. And that's how one man turned the tables on an overreaching HOA, not with anger, but with facts, law, and quiet strength. When they tried to lock him out of his own legacy, they didn't realize he owned the only way in. Let this be a reminder. Know your rights, protect what's yours, and never let anyone rewrite your story without a fight. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life tales of justice, resilience, and redemption. And remember, sometimes the best revenge is just knowing the truth and standing your ground.